With the abundance of movie-inspired games that released during the PlayStation 2 generation, let's just say there were a number of different games that reached great heights of success, but at the same time we often know that movie games aren't always considered the best in their category, as a lot of them, for whatever reason, would end up being like cash grabs or to try and capitalise on the success of popular films, but just didn't hit the mark when it came to the gameplay front. They just felt either rushed or unpolished in many ways. But there would be some exceptions to the rule, with some of the games being really good. But the problem is that a lot of well-known film franchises, even more popular comic book characters that films were based on, that would see a lot of other games released in the past, but again, a lot of the games would be mixed in terms of how they would play, because there were so many different elements in terms of their ideas that, yes, they were interesting to say the least, but they didn't hit the ground running or hit home in the way that would have been expected, and as a result the games usually flopped or felt very lackluster in their overall approach and just weren't received well overall, which is a pity. So it often left that future games featuring popular comic book characters, especially in movies, it was always kind of a mixed element, as people were often skeptical as to how the game would look, feel and play, and their expectations weren't really that high, and it would often result in, when you did get a good game every now and then, it still wouldn't be well received with regards to reviews and magazines, I guess from the old guard, because they were very set in their ways in many ways, which I think a lot of reviewers were, even to the current day. They have a particular interesting way at looking at video games. Yes, they have their ways and they have their reasons and their arguments, which some I agree with, some I don't, but I think in many cases there's certain games out there that do deserve to get a lot more attention than they did, and they were a lot better than what were perceived. But I think it goes back to the caveat of the quality of older games not being as good as they should have been, and as a result that any new games that would come up featuring popular characters were often scrutinised to a point that they never really had a chance, even though they were a lot better. And one of those games personally for me would come in the form of Batman Begins, that would release in the year 2005, around the same time as the iconic film's release, that was developed by Eurocom for the GameCube, PlayStation 2 and Xbox, and Vicarious Visions would also release a port for the Game Boy Color and even mobile devices. That would be based off of the story from the original film itself, but add in a few other elements to try and bridge the gaps, if you will. But what's interesting about Batman Begins is that the game also features all of the original voice actors and characters from the original film, with Christian Bale as Batman, you had Liam Neeson as Ra's al Ghul, Morgan Freeman's character as Lucius Fox, you had Michael Caine as Alfred. Like, there was so many big characters, iconic actors that filled the roles in this game, even with the film, that it was hard not to deny. The cast was just crazy. Even with Gary Oldman playing as Jim Gordon, there was so many unique and well-known actors playing these roles. It was just very cool. And if you're a fan of the film, which I am, I would put this down as one of my favourite Batman movies ever. Like, right, the original Batman movie with Michael Keaton in 1989, that is a masterpiece in all regards, and I would go down and say that that probably is my favourite Batman movie. But I have to admit, Batman Begins for me, I think, is the closest that I would have to any superhero movie that I've ever really enjoyed, even more so than the iconic 1989 film, and for a number of reasons for me, which I think there was a lot of elements in Batman Begins that really stuck out. It made it more modernised, but it made the character a lot more human and more relatable, even with the other characters that had just as much of an influence on the whole dynamic of the film itself and the story, even more so than Batman himself. But what I enjoyed most about Batman Begins, and why I consider it to be easily one of my favourite movies of all time, is the unique concept and narrative. There were so many distinctive scenes that stood out. There was so much atmosphere. It was dark, it was gritty, it was very well put together. The atmosphere, yeah, and the tension really stood out, but for me it was the unique words of wisdom from the characters themselves, the things that they would say, and a lot of it was relatable. A lot of it really stuck with me, even now to the current day, that there are certain elements that I found relatable to me as a person, that I can relate to and I do stand by even now to the current day, and a lot of that made sense to me even back then, and that's why it still makes sense to me even now. And those features did predominantly make their way into the game, especially with the characters. There's certain things that they say and it really hits home. If anything, it opens your eyes up and wakes you up to the realities of life in the real world in many ways. I know it's a movie and a lot of it is fictional, which it is, but there's a lot of elements that were mentioned in the film that does reflect onto real life and can be portrayed in real life if you manage to be noticeable or aware of it. And that's what I really liked about this film, is just the little snippets of information and useful information that could change everything for you if you used it the right way. But even regards to how good the movie was and is, while many would consider The Dark Knight and even The Dark Knight Rises probably to be better movies. And I would agree to that in some way, but out of those three movies, Batman Begins for me is my favourite one, hands down. And I think for those reasons alone, like I just mentioned. But as in for the game, yes, when it did come out, the reviews were decent at best, but it didn't hit the same heights that the movie did. And I think there was a lot of skepticism around the character or even just the game itself, because previous games from the Batman franchise weren't as well received. You had like Batman Dark Tomorrow, which would have been the last mainstream game that released on the Nintendo GameCube, that tried a different approach to the Batman universe, and it just didn't hit home the way that it could have done. Like, it was dark, it was atmospheric, and it tried to be something different, but it was hard to play and difficult. So I think every game that came out after that just always had that cloud over its head in terms of how it was going to be represented. But in saying that, this game exceeded a lot of those expectations, regardless of what you say about the reviews, because if anything, I would easily go out on a limb and say this is by far one of the best movie inspired games I have ever played, without question. And it's one of my favourite all-time games on the PlayStation 2. Actually, for me, it's one of the best games, one of my favourite games ever, because I love the movie, and this game has so much relatable content to the movie that it's a no-brainer to play it, because it follows the plot of the film but fills in the gaps, if you will, where you have more of an interactive role with the character of Bruce Wayne on his ascension to become the Batman character, and you feel like you have a part to play in it, which I think is really cool. Plus, with the voiceovers from all of the iconic actors and their unique one-liners and just snippets of wisdom, definitely makes it relatable. But not only that, the one thing I will say, I remember when this game came out, originally I didn't play it within the first few months of its release, even though I had watched the film, but when I did play it, I was completely blown away by how good I thought it was. Yes, it was a bit tricky to get into at first, especially with the camera angles and stuff, because the gameplay can be fast paced, even though there's a lot of stealth and action based elements. But the one thing that was distinctive, that really stood out, was the darkness and the tension and the atmosphere. It managed to capture all of those elements from the film itself, way better than most movie inspired games that I've ever played, especially for its time. And for me, it's still as good today as it's ever been in that regard. Right, it may not be considered as the best movie inspired game that's out there, but I would definitely go out and say that it is one of the best. It's definitely one of my favourites, if not my favourite movie inspired game that I've played. Now, not everyone will agree with that, but you know what, that's okay. But I genuinely think that it is. But not only is the atmosphere really unnerving and really captures the essence of what it's trying to do, the graphics for the time, without question, and that was one of the major talking points in the likes of the reviews, is that even the reviewers highly praised the voice acting, but even more so the visuals of the game, because they were and are stunning. Like, without a doubt, not only is this for me one of the best movie inspired games, but it's also without a doubt one of the most graphically impressive and stunning games visually that I've ever seen on the PlayStation 2. It has all the likeness of all of the original characters and scenes from the movie itself. The game visually is just a masterpiece in how it presents itself. Definitely one of the greatest looking games I've ever played on the console, without question. And the fact is that it has all of the elements tied in from one of my all-time favourite movies. What more could you want? Now, like I said, whether people agree with me on that, maybe not, and that's okay, but it's not going to change my opinion of the game, not one bit. Yes, it's tricky at times and you will die at certain elements because you can forget yourself and not know what to do, and it will take a few tries to figure out how to complete some of the game's challenges, but you won't be long figuring it out. Now, if I did have one gripe with the game, is that yes, the levels themselves, while they look stunning, the game is very linear. It's literally just get from point A to point B and just keep progressing the story, but you can do it either just by going in all guns blazing or by literally using stealth, which in some cases you will have to use stealth, because especially when you're coming across more powerful enemies or enemies that use more weapons or like guns and stuff, there is an air of strategy to the proceedings, because you really have to think about your surroundings and be aware of your surroundings in order to take advantage of the situation. But the one thing I think what this game really did was it set the bar really high for everything that was to come after it, because when you look even just a couple of years later with Batman Arkham Asylum or the Batman Arkham series, which is the best superhero video game series of all time, and I had them on the PlayStation 3 and they're absolutely phenomenal games, but yet at the same time very frustrating, because you really need to be good and have your wits about you when you're playing those games. But in regards to Batman Begins, I think that this was the precursor to that, because it had a lot of those elements, like being aware of the combat, being able to interchange between different combat situations where you could take on multiple opponents at a time and to block and to dodge. While the button combinations were different and would take a bit of getting used to, you could interact with different enemies at different times, so you could kick one and punch the other and then move back and then dodge and block, and very similar gameplay aesthetics that you would later see and that would be perfected in games like Arkham Asylum. While those elements may not have been as polished in Batman Begins, but I do genuinely think that they set the ground and foundations for what was to come after it. I really do think that. But that doesn't take away from what this game game represents. It is reflection of its time. It was something different. Yes, it is linear to a degree, but it is a very, very good and solid title, and without a doubt, regardless of what people say, in my opinion, one of the best movie inspired games I have ever played. And it's funny, it's one that I didn't play in the beginning when it first came out, but when I did play it, I was like, damn, this game's awesome. So much so that I went back and played this game a ton, even going back to play and record footage for this video, which I hadn't played it in a couple of years. It was just like when I went to play, it's like, yeah, this game's awesome. I still love this game, and I still ended up going and playing it for quite a while, so that'll tell you how good it is. It's a lot better than you would think it is. For a movie inspired game, this is really good, regardless of what the reviews say. Now, it may not be for everybody. If you don't like linear style games, yeah, you probably will find that a bit of a thing, but if you're a fan of Batman and you want to see the early elements of what would form into the iconic Arkham series, this is definitely the go-to game. Definitely one of the best movie inspired games on the console, if not the best one, as I know there are a ton of them out there, but there's very few that are considered great. While there is some decent titles, don't get me wrong, but it's hard to say which games are considered great. While I know this game didn't get great reviews, I still think of it as one of the best I've ever played. But then I'm just a massive fan of the film, so for me it was just inevitable to want more of that, and the game does give you that in all regards. Like I said, it allows you to play from a different perspective, get a different insight into the story or the background of the movie itself, and even fill in a few gaps along the way. A very, very cool game indeed. If you're a fan of the film, of the series, and if you're a fan of Batman in general, you need to play this game. Simple as that. It has all of the grittiness, dark elements, atmosphere, tension, everything that's familiar with the movie. You will get that here and then some. And if you're genuinely a fan of stealth gameplay with other games likes of Splinter Cell, Metal Gear Solid and other games like it, you'll be right at home here with this one. Plus you get to drive the Tumbler or the Batmobile in the movie at different points. So that in itself is another reason to give it a try. Yeah, a really cool title. A very underrated title, mind you. I think it deserves a lot more attention than it originally got. So I would definitely recommend you give this one a go, because it did release on the PlayStation 2, it did release on the Xbox, it did release on the GameCube, and even with other ports on other systems with mobile devices and the Game Boy Advance. So there's no reason not to play this game. So all I'm going to say is just give it a go. You'll see for yourself. And with that being said, I would love to know your thoughts of this iconic game and what do you think of it overall. Are you a fan of it? Are you even a fan of the movie as well and the series in general? And what do you think of it overall? So be sure to share it down in the comments below. And if you would like to see more content that I have covered previously on the channel that covers a lot more of these movie inspired games more in great detail, then you can check out this playlist here on screen to see more of those games in action.